annual Scholar in Residence program is made possible through the generous support of individuals and organizations, including Tauby Philanthropies, the Corrette Foundation, and the Power and Partnership Fund, which is an aligned grants program supporting the Bay Area JCCs. We also want to thank all of our co-sponsoring organizations, the PJCC, Peninsula Temple Bethel, Peninsula Sinai Congregation, Peninsula Temple Shalom, Congregation Beth Jacob, and Ronald C. Wornick Jewish Day School. And I'll tell you that when we proposed bringing Rabbi Ellenson many months ago in like a clergy meeting, all of my colleagues' eyes went like this and said, oh, what an incredible idea. So we're all really just like so happy finally to be at this weekend where we get to learn with Rabbi Ellenson, and you'll see that he's just the biggest mensch and thinker combined. And the last day I've been privileged to hear his stories and his perspective really blended together. So you're in for a treat. As this series is free to our community, obviously, it's a large investment by all of our co-sponsors, so we do welcome your donations either to or both to Jewish Life at PJCC department or your home organization to continue to support these events. We really want to do it together with you. Another shared initiative of our Jewish community is launching the Melton School of Adult Jewish Learning. After many moons of planning and thinking it through, we'll be launching Melton here in the end of April. There are flyers out at our reception, and we'll make sure that everyone online gets information as well. Rebecca and I, our PJCC Jewish Life staff, will be teaching the opening 2 classes this spring, one on Monday evening and one on Tuesday morning. In person, and we plan to have faculty from all of our partner organizations, different rabbis, educators, and beyond over the next year and more. So you can visit meltonschool.org/PJCC to see the 2 classes and to learn more. We also have really incredible launch promo code discounts for members of the affiliated Jewish community. We know it's expensive to support and be part of the Jewish community, and so we've been able to lower the tuition for people who are, supporting our organizations with your dues, with your tuition, with your membership. So that's really nice. Okay, our frequent learner game. So you have, if you're here in person, you have a frequent learner card. Some of them have already been pre-gold check marked, so you don't get the rush of getting that sticker right on in the moment. But if yours is not pre-checked, then you can see Rebecca in the back, and she'll give you your gold star. And as a reminder, this is actually an idea of our Jewish Life Committee Chair, Ellen Solomon, who's here. And we wanted to bring some friendship and fun into our scholars so that it's not just about receiving Torah, but building community. So if you come to at least 4 events this weekend, you'll get invited to a party that we're going to throw for you once the weather calms down. So you'll send us your card at the end, or you can turn it in to your hosting organization at the end of the weekend. Okay, any questions? Great. Everyone on Zoom still with us? Great. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Rabbi Dr. David Ellenson. Rabbi Ellenson served twice, actually, as the president of Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, as well as professor emeritus of the Near Eastern and Judaic Studies program at Brandeis University and the Schusterman Center there. He is a leader in the Reform movement and truly a rabbi's rabbi. And I can tell you that the 30 rabbis in our program this morning from across Northern California would agree with you and just were so touched by his Torah and taking care of us as well. Rabbi Ellenson is internationally recognized for his work in the areas of Jewish religious thought and ethics, modern Jewish history, and emerging trends in American Jewish life. And these are themes that you'll hear throughout the weekend. He's an outspoken advocate for religious tolerance and pluralism, both in Israel and within the American Jewish community. Widely respected for his scholarship, integrity, respectful discourse, and menschlichkeit, just being a really good person. Rabbi Ellenson's collaborative leadership has reflected his commitment to advancing Jewish unity. And I'm so pleased, Rabbi Ellenson, please come share your Torah with us.
Well, Erev Tov, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you in person, and certainly all the people who are here with us via the wonders of technology. I have to say, I'm kind of amazed that so many of you were here in person. I lived in California for 23 years, from 79 to 2001. And my own experience when I lived here was, if there was a drop of rain, people wouldn't usually get on the roads. And when I saw the forecast, I was assured, oh, okay, good. I actually assumed there would be a tsunami today. When Rabbi Maskin picked me up and I walked outside of the hotel after teaching this morning, and I saw, I mean, it was raining, there's no question about it, but I thought I was about to meet with a couple of friends who live in the Berkeley area, and they wouldn't come over today because they feared the deluge that was about to come down. And the last thing I'll say on the topic of weather, which is not my topic tonight, my nieces live in Lake Tahoe, and they did experience the equivalent of a snowed tsunami. So it was, it's with great pleasure that so many of you are here and that others of you are on Zoom. I admire your courage in doing this. What I'd like to do over the next 45 minutes or so, and I'm going to hope that we'll have time for questions and comments. I want to try to present a panorama of the American Jewish story and talk about what it means ultimately to come to this moment of post-ethnicity, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment, though I'll just telegraph it at the very beginning. The Jewish community, by and large in America, has moved from a relatively, or indeed strongly ethnically homogeneous community to one that is incredibly heterogeneous. And I want to try to indicate how that has happened and what that probably means in many ways for this particular moment. I want to also emphasize that had I given this talk, and I was talking to Lori about it before, even 4 or 5 years ago, it might have been a bit different in the following way. I would have asserted that using the title of a book written by a UCLA anthropologist, she wrote a book entitled How Jews Became White Folk, and what that says about race and ethnicity in America. In other words, Jews in this country had acculturated to such a degree that Jews were actually, in quotes, indistinguishable from other Caucasian elements in the American population, and that anti-Semitism was by and large regarded as kind of a vestigial remnant in certain circles in the United States, but nothing that anyone would actually talk about or consider. And I think a lot of that has really changed over just the last 2 to 3 years. So I want to try to talk about all of these themes tonight and, you know, get your wisdom on it and your own thoughts. So let me first try to talk about the element of ethnicity in the United States and deal with it particularly in terms of the Jewish community. So I want to begin, and this will be the shortest class you will ever have as a panoramic view of American Jewish history. I want to go back to 1654 when 19 Sephardic Jews from Recife in Brazil came to what was then New Amsterdam, today New York City. During the colonial period of American Jewish history and the early Federalist period, almost all the Jews who came to the United States during that period, and certainly the dominant element amongst them during the colonial period, were Jews of Sephardic descent. In the United States during that period, the first 6 Jewish settlements were Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, Richmond, Virginia, Philadelphia, New York, and Newport. All of these were then port cities. For those of you who know anything about Virginia, you may know that Richmond, Virginia is 90 miles up the James River from the Atlantic Ocean, but given the size of vessels during that period, Richmond became a major port city during the colonial period. I mention all of this because almost all the Jews who came to the United States during this period were not only culturally descended from Sephardic ancestry, but in addition to which, almost all of them were merchants during this period, and hence they worked in these particular cities. The other key point that I would mention is that by 1790, I won't try to get into the details about how American population was counted. You may remember that persons of African-American descent were counted as 3/5 of a person. But in 1790, in the census, there were approximately 11 million persons living in the United States. How many do you think were Jewish of the 11 million? Any idea? Well, much less than 2%. One of the reasons why I'm lecturing tonight, and I asked a trick question, is I actually know the answer to it. There were about 3,000 Jews of the 11 million people. So when people, if they try to assert that the Jews really dominated during that period, that's factually stretching it quite a bit. The community was prosperous, but the other issue is there was an article written once by a man named Malcolm Stern, a scholar, and one of the nice things from an historian's viewpoint is that if you have 3,000 people and you have an archive like the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati, you can actually go to the archive, and if you spend, give or take 10 years, you can look up every single one of these people, which is exactly what Dr. Stern did. And one of the things he found was that during this period, 28.7% of Jews married people born non-Jewish. So there was a degree of what I'm going to call ethnic heterogeneity or intermixing. And in part, one of the reasons why you had, is that me or? Oh, I thought some other biographical fact that probably you don't need to know. I just got hearing aids last week and they kind of ring on occasion. And I thought, oh, and the doctor had told me about this. And I thought, oh, well, maybe my hearing aids are ringing right now. But apparently it wasn't me. I sometimes hear sounds in my ears the last couple of days. Anyway, I won't go on about it in that way. So that one of the key points I do want you to note is that there was a degree of intermarriage that took place during the colonial period. In part, particularly now, I'm just going to say in that era, there was only heterosexual marriage. In general, if people marry each other, they actually have to meet in general. And there just weren't enough Jewish men and Jewish women for them to, as it were, marry among themselves. So that is actually a theme in American Jewish history that has its roots during the colonial period. In addition, while the Sephardim dominated in this period in American Jewish history is often referred to as the period of Sephardic domination. That is to say, Sephardim, their liturgy, their practices, their customs dominated during this period. There were people of Ashkenazic descent who came. And it is sort of interesting to read that on occasion, where Sephardic Jews married Jews of Germanic or Ashkenazic descent, there were all sorts of negative comments that Sephardic Jews would make about what they called Yehudis, namely Jews of Germanic descent. I bring this up because even intra-ethnically in the Jewish community, it is not unusual in ethnic groups for people of one ethnic group to look negatively upon people from another ethnic group, even if they share the title Jew and even if they are share a common religious tradition. So all of this was true, and this will become a constant theme in American Jewish history that we'll deal with in later years. Events begin to change in America, and the Jewish community first begins to have large numbers of people from 1815 to 1881. During this period, about 225,000 Jews come to the United States, and almost all of these Jews are of Germanic or Central European descent. German is a language that they all speak. Many of them, by the way, settled in this very odd place called San Francisco, and they created their institutions here. Some of you have undoubtedly seen the Frisco Kid. So you can just think about what San Francisco represented to Europeans during this period. You may remember the Gene Wilder, the movie begins. I mean, I love the opening scene. You have these rabbis in a Polish yeshiva, and they're saying there's some place we never heard of. They want a rabbi, and they make the comment, and they say, well, who's the worst student in the yeshiva? And they say, well, the worst student is Gene Wilder. So they send Gene Wilder to the United States, and he comes to San Francisco to be the rabbi of the community. And it's Harrison Ford. I recommend the movie very highly. The Jews who came to the United States during that period were ethnically really homogeneous, and they outnumbered the Sephardic Jews who had been here previously by approximately 80-1. So this period in American Jewish history is often referred to as the period of Germanic domination. One of the interesting things about this period is you have to ask, why is it that all of these Jews came? And the reason why people tend to emigrate and immigrate in almost every instance, thank you. Okay. The reason why people emigrate or immigrate in almost any period is there have to be what you'd call push me, pull you factors. The push me factors is that in Europe, you would had the French Revolution, but you'll ultimately remember that at the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon was defeated. And in 1815, you had the Congress of Vienna. Napoleon had brought with him, and this will be important in terms of understanding the Jews who came here. Napoleon had brought with him the tenets of enlightenment and emancipation. And Jews actually were emancipated in Europe during the Napoleonic era. The Congress of Vienna was a conservative reactionary Congress that attempted to restore Europe as it had been prior to the French Revolution. It couldn't do that completely, but it meant that there were a large number of Jews who had begun to taste Western freedom. They were these freedoms and these rights, in other words, the ability to practice any profession you wanted, et cetera. These things were being taken away from them. And as a result, many of these Jews left Europe during this period, but keep in mind, they spoke a Western language, German, and they had tested or experienced Western elements of freedom. It meant that these people were oriented towards change, which is not an insignificant factor when you begin to consider who these people were. They desired acculturation into the larger world that surrounded them. And they had already tasted some of the fruits of Western freedom. In America, remember Jefferson had purchased Louisiana Territory. You have a period of industrialization. Part of why you get huge number of immigrants to the United States in the 1800s is that America needs more workers. And to state this in the most politically incorrect terms I can, America not only needed workers, it wanted people with white skin to come to the United States during that period. Hence, America was really open to these immigrants, Irish, Italians. Constant numbers of people came to the United States during this period. You have an ethnically homogeneous community, and they enter a world They enter a world where there are no national Jewish institutions, none. No Jewish community centers, no United Synagogue, no Union of Orthodox congregations. In fact, there aren't even any denominations. Among the people who come during this period are a number of rabbis. How many ordained rabbis do you think were here during the colonial period, an early Federalist? Zero. That is exactly right. And I just want to say, as a rabbi and an objective historian, with no ordained rabbis, it was the worst period ever in Jewish experience. I don't know if that really was true. I'll leave that to another time. The first rabbi to come to the United States, if you're ever on Jewish Jeopardy, was a man named Abraham Rice. He came to the United States in 1841 to Baltimore, Maryland. So he's the first ordained rabbi to come to the United States. You also have a man named Isaac Mayer Wise, who comes to ultimately Cincinnati, Ohio. Earlier, he had been in Albany. Wise, of course, became the founder of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, the Hebrew Union College, and the Central Conference of American Rabbis, all the major institutions of Reform Judaism. Note, by the way, not one institution he created had the word reform in it, because Wise actually thought that he was creating an American Judaism, and this will be completely relevant for our topic tonight. This community was overwhelmingly homogeneous ethnically. They spoke German, they had an orientation, even when they were traditionalists, towards acculturation and modernity. One of the major things that I want to emphasize here is that for these Jews, acculturation into the larger American culture was their major aim. These Jews, acculturation was a major cultural characteristic of these people. They wanted to participate fully in American life. Of course, there was a high degree of social anti-Semitism during this period. And in light of the other topic that I'm dealing with, there was almost no intermarriage. I don't want to say none. As universal as Wise and later people like Kaufman Kohler would be in the Reform Jewish world, on a social level, there was almost no intermarriage whatsoever. For a minority group to have a high level of intermarriage, now I speak as a sociologist, two factors have to be present. Members of the minority group have to be thoroughly acculturated into the mores of the majority culture. If members of the minority group are not thoroughly acculturated, you will not have a large amount of intermarriage from a sociological perspective. But what else needs to be true if members of a minority group are going to marry people who aren't members of a minority group or members of the majority culture? They not only have to be acculturated, but what else? What about the larger culture? What has to be true if there's going to be a high level of intermarriage for minority group members? I'm not talking about individual cases, but for there to be a sociologically significant amount of intermarriage. What has to be true in terms of the larger culture's attitude towards members of the minority group? They have to be accepting. There have to be two factors that are present for there to be a high rate of, I'll show you I have a PhD, instead of saying intermarriage, for there to be a high rate of endogamy. Members of the minority group have to be acculturated, and members of the majority culture have to see members of the minority group as desirable marriage partners. The German Jews who came over, even as they sought acculturation, still brought with them, I'll use the term here, a Jewish taboo or a negative attitude towards intermarriage. But in addition, members of the majority culture did not tend to socialize on that kind of level in terms of marriage partners with Jewish people. So that, interestingly, even if you look back in American Jewish history and see how universally oriented, particularly Reform spokespeople were for American Judaism during that period, you have minuscule numbers of intermarriage, nothing like the colonial period, where you had a figure of 28.7%. There was almost no intermarriage, but you had a culturally homogeneous community during that period. When Isaac Mayer Wise in 1875 created the Hebrew Union College, he actually talked about a union of American Jews. He thought that all of these Jews, because they were culturally and religiously homogeneous, he could create a union of all American Israel. But what begins to happen in 1881? Who begins to come? Yeah, people like my grandparents start to show up here. By 1883, you have 200,000 Eastern European Jews. And by 1924, when America, in effect, ends immigration from Eastern Europe and elsewhere, over 2 million Eastern European Jews have come. So that what you have during this period is a kind of ethnic heterogeneity that begins to internally mark the Jewish community. In light of the lecture tonight, it's this ethnicity that I want to focus on. It is true that when the Hebrew Union College had its opening rabbinic banquet, when it ordained its first class of rabbis in 1883, a very famous or infamous event occurs. Do you know the name of it? The Treifa Banquet. The Treifa Banquet is, for me as an historian, one of my favorite events in American Jewish history. Benjamin Zold of Baltimore, who was a positive historical or conservative rabbi, was invited to give the address at when the first class was ordained at HUC. He was the father of Henrietta Zold, who established Hadassah. They had a banquet to celebrate the ordination of this class. And now I'm going to introduce, I guess, a kind of sociological term. It's not an halachic term. I want to distinguish between what I would call high treif and low treif. Low treif, I would define as, I don't know, you go to McDonald's and you just eat a hamburger. The meat wasn't prepared in a kosher way. It's treif meat, but you don't have cheese on it, etc. But let's say you go to McDonald's and you have a Big Mac, and then you say, put a couple of shrimp on this, and then let me have clam sauce. That would be high treif. The banquet that Wise held was an embodiment of what I would call high treif. It upset people like Benjamin Zold, etc. And as a result, in part, the Jewish Theological Seminary was created. But I want to look at this from an historian's point of view. Wise could talk about a union of American Israel as long as there was a relatively high degree of ethnic homogeneity among the Jews. The Sephardic Jews were just too minuscule. There just weren't enough of them to make a difference once the German Jews came over. They completely dominated, as I said, by a ratio of 80+1. Suddenly you have all these Eastern European Jews, and that is actually when what I would call classical Reform Judaism emerges in the United States. There are certainly theological and halachic distinctions among the movements, but as an historian, I would make the claim, and in light of the thesis tonight about ethnicity, the reason why you have in the end reform and conservative movements in America is because they represented different ethnic trends within the American Jewish community. Wise creates a Treifa banquet, which for Jews of Eastern European or traditional descent is just absolutely intolerable. And there are historians who claim, and it may be correct because some of them I respect immensely, they claim that it was a caterer's mistake or error. And that may be true, but now I want to speak as someone who later was the president of Hebrew Union College. I can assure you, well, I might not know what would be served at a given banquet if the Hebrew Union College held it, but I can tell you this. If I walked into the room and suddenly saw that shrimp, crab, etc., was being served, at the very least, I would begin by apologizing to people, and I'd tell them to remove it and bring out the tuna fish and egg salad, as it were. Wise never apologized to anyone. Now, there are people who contend Wise himself was, gosh, I want to use a nice adjective. He was kind of arrogant. So it may be that he just wasn't apologizing, but from an historian's point of view, he was actually giving a message to the Eastern European Jews. Namely, Judaism is not a religion that is devoted to what goes into your stomach, but it's really a universal religion that's in accord with the highest dictates of reason and ethics. And if what you want is a Judaism that's going to worry about the minutiae of kashrut, just go away from us. We don't really need you. And the other thing then that begins to occur is a platform is written in 1885 that actually says that. We're a non-nationalistic religion. We're universal in our orientation, rational, and we have little to do with Jewish religious ritual in any way. Platforms are written for two reasons. One, they attempt to describe for a group what they stand for and what is most significant to them, but they also serve what sociologists call a boundary maintenance function. It tells you who's in and who's out. And in effect, Wise and Kohler and others who were leaders of reform were actually saying, you Eastern European Jews with your folkways and your religious ritual and your empathy for Zion and Shivat Zion, a return to Israel, this is not our religion. And the other thing that begins to occur, for the first time in Jewish history, this never occurred in Europe, really, the yarmulke is removed in worship for males. That is really an American invention that occurs principally in the 1880s and 90s. And then finally in 1895, how many of you have ever seen the Union Prayer Book? So if you're raised as a religious traditionalist, in other words, when I think of people like my Bubbies and Zadies, to say to them, we don't want you in a Reform congregation, but I'm trying to imagine saying to my Eastern European grandfather, who basically only spoke Yiddish his entire life. I never quite understood how he engaged in business. And my mother used to keep the books for her grandfather. For my grandfather, he was he owned a junkyard, used auto parts. I think in many cases, Jews engaged in this business. The books were kept in Yiddish. I mean, he couldn't really read English. And to me, he spoke what I'd call Yinglish, which was an admixture of Yiddish and English. You didn't have to say to my grandfather, I can imagine saying, Zeta, come, we're going to the temple. You're going to remove your yarmulke. You can't wear a tallis. And we're going to not daven, but we're going to pray from the Union Prayer Book. You don't have to have a sign that says dogs, cats, and Eastern European Jews are not welcome here. People like my grandfather wouldn't want to go. The key point I want to make is that just as there was a degree of ethnic friction between Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews during the colonial period, there was an unbelievable amount of ethnic friction between German and Eastern European Jews. And to be here in the Bay Area, I couldn't even exaggerate what these frictions would be when you think of places like Emmanuel and Shearith Israel on the one hand, and more traditional congregations on the other. What that leads to is the growth of conservative Judaism. In Germany, you only had Orthodoxy and liberal Judaism. I won't go into all the details about that now, but what becomes important in terms of our considerations tonight is that there were theological differences between the movements. I don't deny that, but Reform Judaism became what I'm going to call the folk religion of German Jews, and conservative Judaism became the folk religion of Eastern European Jews. Remember, the Eastern Europeans, to quote my teacher at Columbia, Arthur Hertzberg, they didn't walk, they ran out of the ghettos. They wanted to participate in American life. When Abe Fortas's family moves to Tennessee, Justice Fortas or Justice Goldberg in Chicago, they don't send Abe Fortas or Justice Goldberg to yeshivot. Justice Goldberg graduates as valedictorian of Northwestern Law School at the age of 21. Justice Fortas graduates Yale Law School. These parents wanted their children to participate in American life. They wanted acculturation, but they also wanted a modern, dignified Judaism. So they introduced conservative synagogues that have traditional services. I won't get into all the details now, but omit the certain parts of Jewish liturgy that are viewed as being xenophobic or overly particularistic or irrational, to pray for the restoration of sacrifices, etc. These changes begin to occur, and they create a modern, as it were, decorative service. All you have to do is look at the synagogues that were built by both Reform and conservative Jews to see how anxious they were to indicate we all have a place in American society. Because there were 2 million Eastern European Jews and they were Zionist in their orientation, they wanted a service in which there was a degree of Hebrew. They wanted certainly at the very least, the external signs of tradition to be observed. They wouldn't have been comfortable in Reform congregations. They wanted bar mitzvah, not bat mitzvah during the early part of this time. You have an ethnic split principally in the Jewish community. When we talk about post-ethnicity today, part of what I've been trying to say during these last 25 to 30 minutes is that what you need to understand initially is that there were ethnic divides in the Jewish community, but these ethnic divides were completely intra-ethnic during this entire period because of social attitudes, both on the part of the immigrants who came here, namely marriage to non-Jews was taboo, and because non-Jews didn't see Jews as social equals, you had a degree of social anti-Semitism. There is almost, statistically speaking, no intermarriage. I don't want to say there's none, but I just want to say to all of you here, if you have Jewish ancestors prior to 1950 who were intermarried, from a sociological, historical perspective, you represent way less than 10% of the Jewish population. There's almost no intermarriage. Suddenly, we now move all the way to the post-World War II period. And by the way, during this period, and I may talk about this more on Sunday, by far the dominant religious group among Jews, simply because of numbers, are conservative Jews. Are conservative Jews. In fact, as late as 1990, 42% of Jews in America, when asked on surveys, how do you identify? They identified as conservative Jews, 40% identified as Reform. By 2012, 13, 14, with the Pew study, the number of Jews who identify as conservative in America are 18%. The Reform movement, 35%, and the largest growing group of American Jews are the nuns. I don't mean here the Catholic sisters. I mean N-O-N-E. They don't identify with any denomination whatsoever. But the key point I want to make is that prior to 1970, what you have principally is an intra-ethnic division among American Jews, people of Eastern European and German descent. That begins to change. First, as the Eastern European Jews come to America and acculturate, they begin to be more and more culturally indistinguishable from the German Jews. They begin to be culturally more and more indistinguishable. I could look at my own family. My grandparents on my mother's father's side came to don't ask me how, from Lithuania to Newport News, Virginia, which recently was in the headlines because a 6-year-old boy shot his teacher there. But I'll leave that aside for a moment. Newport News, Virginia is not an Ir v'Ein b'Yisrael. It's not a mother city among the Jewish people. My father went to college at William and Mary, which is not really a bastion of Jewish studies. And then I told this story somewhere, maybe last night, I don't know. My father ended up going to Harvard for law school. My mother was from Cambridge, and she met my father at Hillel at Harvard. To give you an idea of how different ethnicity was then, my grandmother in Boston would not initially allow the engagement. The idea of intermarriage for her, of a Jew with a non-Jew, was an anathema to her. I mean, trying to put this nicely, it was probably worse than that. And my mother at the time said, well, how could he not be Jewish? I met him. You can look at my face. And said his name is Sam. He speaks Yiddish. How could he possibly, I met him at Hillel. He keeps kosher. How could he possibly not be Jewish? And my grandmother's line was, the boys at Harvard are very smart. He may just want a Jewish girl. Until I meet his mother, there's no engagement. So much for patrilineal descent. So at that time, my grandmother from Virginia had to come up. I'll just say she looked like an Eastern European Jewish woman, to put it rather mildly. The other grandmother takes a look at this woman, sees my father kissing his mother, says, is that Sam's mother? And my mother says, well, it must be. They're speaking Yiddish, they're kissing. And she says, okay, the marriage is on. She wanted matrilineal descent, no question about it. By 1970, this begins to change, because by that point, you're entering the third generation of Eastern European Jewishly descended people in this country. First generation are my grandparents speaking English at best. Then their children, who were raised with a taboo against intermarriage and living in a social world where marriage with Jews is frowned upon. By the time you get to my generation, the grandchildren of the Eastern European immigrants, in the 1970 National Jewish Population Study, almost 30% of Jews intermarried who got married between 1960 and 1970. In other words, my generation is the first one where sociologically speaking, you began to have issues of inter-ethnic Judaism. In other words, it's not quite post-ethnicity yet, but it's starting. By 1992 in the population study, 52% of Jews are marrying people born non-Jewish. And in the last Pew study, what do you think the percentage is of Jews who marry non-Jews in America today? Yeah, it's about 72% in the most recent study. That means if you live in any typical and particularly non-Orthodox community in the United States, 80 to 90% of the children in your Hebrew school or day school will have non-Jewish grandparents, aunts, uncles. This is what post-ethnicity means. It's just a reality. In the world I grew up in, there was virtually complete ethnic homogeneity. The only rivalries were between German and Eastern European Jews, and all of that dissipates as you move through the 20th century. We today live in a community that is genuinely post-ethnic. That is to say, from a cultural, religious perspective, the rates of endogamy in the Jewish community today are such that we no longer live in a world of just complete ethnic heterogeneity. In addition, there have been hundreds of thousands of other Jews who have come to the United States from Iran, many from South Africa, and even Israelis. I don't know what the most recent studies show. The highest group in America of intermarried Jews are secular Israelis who move here. Or let me rephrase it. The LA community once did a study in the 80s and 90s, and the highest group of intermarrieds came from secular Israelis who were here in the United States. We live in a community that is highly, highly post-ethnic, and that is just a reality of the world in which we live. The question then comes to be, what are the attitudes that people have living in a post-ethnic world? We have to also remember that it's almost axiomatic that for Jews, part of how we live in the world, we mirror the larger culture of which we are a part. The Pew study of American religions of a decade ago indicates that we are a nation of changers. 76% of all Americans do not identify as adults with the religious denomination into which they were born. Only 24% of people, let's say, who were raised as Baptist identify as Baptist as adults. Many of them become nuns, meaning N-O-N-E-S, but many of them change and they go to other religious traditions. It's just a reality of the world in which we live, in addition to which we live in a world, by and large, that talks about the import of the individual. And as a result, in this kind of culture, people seek happiness. By the way, there's nothing wrong with seeking happiness. It's actually a very positive thing to desire. But you need to keep in mind that all of these represent great, great challenges for the Jewish community in terms of how it will identify itself in this world. The last point I want to make is that ideas that I grew up with then beyond religiosity, namely the role of the state of Israel in forging Jewish identity. It is true, and Lori reminded me of this, there were certainly fights between Jews of Germanic descent who created institutions like the American Council for Judaism. They were obviously many Jews who were anti-Zionist. But the reality is, from a historian's point of view, World War II ended that. The Zionist Organization of America, which had less than 20,000 members in 1938, had over 500,000 members by 1945. The Holocaust put an end to the debate about whether do the Jews need a state for their defense. It just kind of ended that debate, which doesn't mean that these debates didn't occur in certain circles, but among large numbers of people. Today, we live in a world where Israel doesn't assure unity on the part of Jewish people in the way that it did before. By the way, many of the things I'm talking about tonight, I have personal opinions about. I'm not very happy about that, to put it rather mildly. I mean, I'll give one individual. I mean, I am a Zionist, and Israel is the very center of my own being and identity. The notion that Israel doesn't promote Jewish unity is beyond sad to me. But as a sociologist, historian, and as a lecturer tonight, I just recognize that this is a reality of the world in which we live, and that there are certainly so-called progressive forces in America that are extremely critical of the state of Israel, and we need to be mindful of that as we educate our own youth and attempt to bring them in to a stronger sense of Jewish identity. So all of these are factors that have really helped to identify where we are today. And in many ways, we live in a Jewish world that is just radically different from the Judaism I grew up with. I may be, and my children to some extent, but certainly me at 75, am part of the last, I'm going to call it, ethnic generation of American Jews. My Judaism was forged in large measure by growing up in an ethnically Eastern European descended Jewish home. I knew my grandparents. I spoke with them. I learned a degree of Yiddish. We had certain amounts of religious observance. Israel was at the very center of our identity as Jews. I recognize that with my grandchildren, they are going to grow up in a radically different world. The amazing thing about this, and with this I'll conclude and then allow you all to make comments and offer suggestions and improvements on what I've said tonight. We face radically different challenges, but what is also true is the Jewish community has not simply atrophied and died. Many of you may know the name of a great scholar. Many of you do not, I'm sure, but named Shimon Ravidovich. If you spell Ravidovich correctly, you get extra points on the final exam. Ravidovicz, Shimon Ravidovich. He was the first head of the Near Eastern and Judaic Studies Department at Brandeis. If people were to ask me, except that at 75, I have grown up, who would I like to be when I grow up? It would actually be Shimon Ravidovich. He knew everything in the Jewish literary tradition. He knew philosophy, history. Dr. Ravidovich, among other things, wrote an essay entitled, some of you may know it, The Ever-Dying People. And what he points out in this essay, The Ever-Dying People, is that every generation of Jews has basically thought, we are she'erita pleta, we are the saving remnant, après moi le déluge. I don't know if they said that in Eastern Europe, but after me, it's going to all be over. But the reality is that Dr. Ravidovich pointed out, because our people are always dying, it means they're still alive. And the steps that we take to assure Jewish existence into the future may look differently than what would have been regarded as authentic by my Eastern European forebears. But it doesn't mean that Judaism will die. It means that there can be a sense of a shalshelet Kabbalah, a chain of Jewish tradition that extends from Sinai all the way to the present moment. And what we elect to do makes a difference. First of all, even when you have high degree of what it means to live in a post-ethnic Jewish world, there are people who convert to Judaism. There are people who don't convert, but they come to be part of the Jewish community. I was saying to Lori, in this recent Pew study, the question is in part, how many Jews are there in America? Kind of depends how you count it. There are 4.1 million people in America, according to the Pew study. Maybe it's 4.2. Never know how they get these exact numbers. Who, if you ask them, are you Jewish, answer yes. And if you ask them, what is your religion, they answer Judaism. There are actually 1 million people in this country who, when asked, are you Jewish, say, yes, I'm Jewish. And when you ask them what religion they are, they say, I'm not anything. So there are many sociologists who say the core Jewish population is 5 million plus people who are Jewish and who aren't anything else. There are 1 million people in this survey who say I'm Jewish, but I have a different religion. Christianity, Hinduism. I'm sure in the Bay Area, you know about Jew-boos. I mean, they're all over the place. So from a rabbi's point of view, I'm not very happy with that. But as a sociologist, I recognize that's a reality. And here's the other figure. There are about 2 million people who live in Jewish households. By that, I mean they have a Jewish husband, wife, stepchildren, and these people enter the Jewish community center. They enter synagogues. Many of the non-Jewish custodial parents and grandparents are taking their Jewish children and grandchildren for bar and bat mitzvah lessons. I mean, it becomes a more complicated kind of way of viewing things. I have no idea in a day school like Wornick, for example, it's really a question. I don't know the answer to it. It wouldn't surprise me because there are Jewish day schools where there are non-Jewish children who wish to attend. I don't know if that's true. That is. I mean, it's hard to imagine that 40 and 50 years ago. But these are the realities of what it is. And I call this post-ethnicity because it's just not an ethnic community in the way that it was. Part of what I've tried to say in this lecture is that we always had intra-ethnic Jewish disputes, whether it was between Sephardim and Ashkenazim in the colonial period or between Jews of Germanic and Eastern European descent later. We have transcended those kinds of differences. And the key element to realize is in a post-ethnic era, we have to also recognize, and with this I really will conclude, that in the 2012 survey, when people of Jewish descent were asked, are you proud of being Jewish? 93% said yes. By the way, that might not have been true in the 1950s, where Jews might have been more embarrassed. And I often wonder if they had taken the survey 8 years later, after the events in Pittsburgh and Texas, would Jews be as anxious to say, I'm as proud of being Jewish, as was true in 2012? Remember, I began with the title of the book, How Jews Became White Folk, and what that says about race and ethnicity in America. I wonder if the recent phenomena of anti-Semitism in America has changed Jewish attitudes towards Jewishness. But what I would say is if 90% of people of Jewish descent are proud of being Jewish, then it seems to me there is a chance of bringing them into the community. And the reality is that places like our schools and our JCCs and other places, the way I would look at them is that they become portals of possible entry into Jewish life. And the programs that we create, the camps that we welcome people into, the educational institutions that we create for them, make it possible that there'll be a Jewish renaissance in this country that will be of unparalleled proportions. In other words, my lecture tonight could emphasize the negative elements of what it means to live in a post-ethnic world, but I wouldn't want you to leave without thinking that there are also great possibilities for what the Jewish future will be. I just want to say it won't look exactly like the world I grew up in. As, again, a 75-year-old cisgender, white heterosexual male, I don't know how much my attitudes will inform the community that my children and grandchildren inhabit, but I think we can't lose that kind of hope. And I would recommend, again, you consider what Professor Ravidovich said, that we are an ever-dying people, and it means, therefore, the actions that we take and the programs we establish will help to create what I pray will be, despite all the differences, nevertheless, a secure Jewish future. I thank you all for listening to me tonight. And
thank you so much, Rabbi Ellenson.